We're with Regis McKenna today in our series of oral history interviews, and today we're going to talk about marketing. We're taking a step back from many of the details that we've talked about, and we're going to talk about your overall approach to marketing and how you developed it over time.
Okay.
First of all, just the basic question is, how did you develop your approach to marketing?
Well, for one thing, and later on I think you asked what word would I use and what's the meaning of it, and I have defined this before, that the most important thing for a marketing person or executive or anybody in high tech where the industry is moving so quickly is curiosity. And that is that it drives you to say what's next, or who else might get into my business, or who's in it now that I don't see, or just constantly looking at your surroundings and your situation today and sort of questioning yourself about what are the impacts coming at me. Because Peter Drucker said that there will be more influences from the outside than the inside starting in the 21st century. And of course we've seen that, market events, competition from a global, all of that sort of thing is affecting companies from the outside. And most companies are not aware of anything outside their doorstep. And so you can no longer think about inside. You've got to be aware and have your sensors out in just a variety of ways in order to gather the information and make judgments on it. So theories really are swiftly moving. They never sit still. And so it's not a theory, but theories, because you're constantly changing them. What was in vogue in the 50s and 60s, for example, when probably the main marketing was magazines from technology, because the engineers read the magazines, or in consumer it was television or radio, but mostly television, and that was a demonstration medium. It was not a feedback medium. But as we moved into the age of the microprocessor and the personal computer and the internet, things were now capable, and the bandwidth expanding, with more and more computer power across the networks, you're able to have feedback loops. And so that led from sort of talking about one-to-one marketing in a sense of real-time marketing, which is a book I wrote, and that is that the instantaneous response. And I described that as real-time came from sort of a term I once heard used for military aircraft. If you're in a fighter jet, you don't really have time to react. You have to have the machines sense and react for you. And this is true in a rocket ship, right? I mean, it's sensing the environment and adjusting all the way along the way. So I have this slide that I use, which is a rocket ship going to the moon. And the whole idea is if you don't constantly adjust, you'll go out into space. But to hit the moon, you have to actually go in an arc. And so the rocket ship is sensing what's going on, the thrust, the power, the environment encroaching on it, and then adjusting along the way. Or they're measuring that from the ground support station and adjusting the rockets for you. So you've got to have these mechanisms in a real-time world that continually adjust the market for you. And it's always changing. It's not static. I don't think that the theories that we used in the 30s, 40s, and 50s or 60s really do work today. I think it's, and I'm sure a lot of people disagree with that, and there are still some people I know that are teaching that, those theories, but in fact, in a real-time world, the whole situation has to change.
I want to go back to that notion of the feedback loop. When technology enabled that, you were there, you were on the edge of that curve.
Right.
But I want to go back to that era before that actually happened. Even then, your theories of marketing and the importance of that data back to the company, back to the executives, the product managers, and so forth, was a very important principle. You were talking about needing feedback and needing interaction from your customers from the very beginning as an essential element of marketing. What was that controversial? Was it when you first began talking to people you were talking to in the technology industry out here? Was that hard for them to understand or accept that they needed to get that feedback from the beginning?
Well, there was a couple things. One is that I was very fortunate for some of the people that I worked with in the early days, like Don Valentine at National. Don said, you know, you're only going to learn things if you're out in the marketplace. You're not going to learn back in a desktop, in a cubicle. And so he gave me my freedom to go out and talk to the world. And once you do that, you hear. They volunteer it. You don't even have to ask questions when you go out and you're representing a company. They'll give you the feedback. And that industry, you know, prided itself on telling it like it is, which is a common phrase nowadays. But in fact, the feedback is there, and so you gather it. And I did not have a deep technical background, and so as a result, if I went into a meeting with a group of engineers, and I were to tell them my opinion about something, they would sort of look at me skeptically, and that did happen. But for me to go in and say, well, I was talking to such and such a customer, I was talking to the distributors, I was talking to the reps or the salespeople, that feedback in a meeting to make a point always worked for me. And so I started that fairly early. That's why I started doing sort of customer interviews. Before we went into a client, I would ask for, you know, the names of 10 or 20 of their top customers, and then I would either call them or go visit them if they're convenient. And I got to know a lot of them, and they became similar feedbacks for me on a lot of different things. And that really served me well, because I could bring those into my presentations. I could stand up in front of people and say, well, your customer is saying this and you're saying this. Tell me what's real. And it wasn't me saying it. It was, you know, I was a surrogate. And that works, at least it did for me during that period.
Did anybody push back when you said, I want to talk to some of your customers before we get started?
It's amazing. Some people couldn't even come up with the list, which is really strange, even large companies. You know, they were so bureaucratic that the list was, you know, well, you got to talk to the sales manager, and then he has to talk to regional managers. The regional manager has to talk to the salesman, and they all have to sort of go down the village. So it could take a long time to actually get the names. And a lot of them just didn't want to give it up simply because they felt that you'd be stealing something or passing it on. So there was a lot of this hidden agendas that people wanted to, you know, hold it back from you. But it's where two things that sort of evolved over time was, well, if we were doing this on the outside, why don't we do it on the inside? And so we would have sort of a interview with the top management in the company and some of the salespeople, and then we'd go out and talk to customers and then compare the two similar questions, and you'd get two completely different responses. You know, I got the feedback from the CIO at Citibank in New York that a particular company that we were doing research on had not seen them. This was the largest, at that time, it was the largest bank in America. And the CIO told me that he hadn't seen a representative or a salesman from a particular company in over a year. But inside, they told me just the opposite. Well, we know our customers and we talk to them regularly. And so I was able to put up a slide and say, well, how come one of the top CEOs in the country said they haven't talked to you in over a year? And that upset everybody inside, but it upset the apple cart. And they didn't want. The fact is, some of the people didn't want to work with me anymore after doing that.
I was going to ask you about that, and you just answered that question. How many people would you say, especially as your business developed and your reputation for doing that business and consultation that way developed, how many people actually came to hire you because they knew you would upset the apple cart and you'd push them to do things differently?
Yeah, that also grew over time. I mean, if I have my handwritten notebooks that I've kept since the early 70s. And up until today, I keep notebooks, and they're fairly detailed. And I've been going through them page by page, and they're scanned now, and so I can go through them. And I was pulling out sections and putting them into different files and things. So I've read every page for 15 to 20 years now, and going back. And I noticed that as I went on, as our client list grew in the sense of size of company, so that in the early days, we were working here in the Valley with relatively small startups referred by venture capitalists or somebody that we knew in the area, where eventually I think the work became well known. And so, we were working with people like Xerox corporate back east. We were working with IBM. We were working with NCR. We were working with very large corporations. And in Europe, Olivetti and Boole and the like. And those companies were mainly because they knew something was missing and wanted to put some new kind of life into the company. I had that with Varian, where the new CEO come in and he felt the company was sort of lazy, was hanging in there, but not really being sort of up with the rest of the Valley in the terms of exciting new innovations and so forth. I've had people come to me to hire us to help them rethink their R&D activities in terms of making it more market oriented. And those were larger companies. That's where you can, they don't mind giving you the information if you're on their side and you're trying to find out. John Young invited us in to help him when they came out with their line of risk processors
At HP.
At HP, and John was president, and John was very open and sort of directed us and directed his people to give us what we wanted. So the internal and external audits were always were open for us, and that I think worked very well for both of us in the long run.
I want to turn now to your philosophy about marketing, and preface all this with the statement at the beginning, as we've talked about, which is you define marketing the way Regis McKenna thought about marketing. You didn't define marketing as others define marketing, or even as that term might bring ideas to mind today when people hear it or read it. I want to talk about your approach to helping a company deliver into a market, or develop a market perhaps even where one didn't exist at Apple, certainly one of those types of companies. Talk a little bit about how you thought about it and defined it, and why that was different from the way classically people don't think about marketing.
Yeah, I look at marketing as a feedback loop of learning, where you're constantly engaged with the marketplace, the customers, the channels, even looking at your competitors and getting a feedback, and then you change and they change in the constant loop of exchange of information. So it's a learning process on both sides, so that the customer learns about you and you learn about the customer, and you can gain from listening. And you change your products. People change and adapt based on the products. That's why in the computer industry they used to have beta sites all the time, because they wanted feedback. There were some companies here, in fact the company used to be where we're sitting, who once told me that the beta sites couldn't give them any information. It didn't teach them anything, so they didn't need to do that. They could ignore it. Needless to say, that company vanished, not necessarily just because of that, but in fact the sort of engineering mentality was, we know what's best for the customer. And that's just, that may be true in some instances, but in most instances there's always adaptation to the current marketplace and adaptation to the customer's needs. And I can give you a little case study, is that we were hired to help IBM in Almaden, the IBM, their memory storage division. And before that, they hired us, that whole division was supplying IBM internal computers. There was no external, so it was transfer pricing inside. Everything was done through their own internal mechanisms and rules and regulations and so forth. But they wanted to go OEM, and they felt that they could take it to the world in a quality kind of fashion. The The process, it's a little funny story, but the president of that group, or the GM, was Ray Abizayed, who has passed away, and Ray was a really open, wonderful person. And so I first asked him if I could meet with their salespeople. So I met with their salespeople and had a conversation. It was they were all around this big table in a conference room. And I came out and I went into Ray's office and I said, "You're in trouble." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I was the youngest guy in the room," you know. And I said, "You're not going to have those old-time IBM salesmen calling on, Apple and Compaq and all of the new upstarts in the computer business who are getting into the volumes. You're going to have to get some people that can have a conversation with these people and be on their terms," which is what he did. So he went out and essentially took application engineers who had been in the field and put them into prime sales positions. But I would get calls, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week about, do we negotiate all pricing? Do we use our internal pricing or external pricing? I said, "You do the market pricing." Those sorts of things. They were completely oblivious to sort of what it was to actually put a product out there as a component in a system and how you took it to market. But they ended up turning that into about a $5 billion business in about 5 years. And so it pays off when you get that feedback, and they kept adapting to that, changing the way they do things. They had to get pricing back much faster than taking it up through the corporate hierarchy and getting approvals all the way up through accounting and finance and so forth. And they did change, and they forced it when they saw that this is the way things have to be done.
You really preferred, you insisted on companies getting the product into the market first and learning from that, right? That was your point about Cray, the company whose building this was, choosing not to do with some of its beta sites. So getting the product out there first, from your standpoint, developing market.
You can put prototypes out there, you can do lots of things, but normally even Intel and their microprocessors, it wasn't a big market for them. I mean, the number of OEMs that they sold processors to was relatively small. It wasn't a consumer size. And so it was a few hundred manufacturers that sort of led the various industries, telecom, computing, and instrumentation, and so forth. And so the ability to actually bring them in early into the design process, and oftentimes, at least, and I don't know how it is today, but back in the early days, Intel would actually show them a spec sheet and say, "This is what we're thinking about doing," a small number, "This is what we're thinking about building for the next generation," and get a feedback on it. And then each step along the way, by the time they came to the product, the particular people that they were talking to felt that they had a hand in the design. And so they were literally mostly sold out of those products by the time they launched it onto the marketplace. And I think that, in a way, taking the customer into your confidence, not all of them, but a select group of them. This is why we have user groups. This is why we had beta sites and so forth in the computer industry, because they became sort of part of your company's reference system. And I think you've got to get that going early, not only to raise money. Most venture capital people want to see some traction, they call it, into the marketplace before they loan you money. They want to see some sales, and the way to do that is to bring them in early. You can do it under non-disclosure if you want, and get them engaged in what you're doing and excited about it, and then adapt it. If you have to adapt something, you adapt it. In the IBM case, they had to adapt their interfaces, because not everybody wanted the same interface, and so they had to redesign some of their products to meet the customer's demands. And you do that if you want to get an early traction into a marketplace. You'll jump through all kinds of hoops. But the marketing process is not done by a marketing department, it's done by everybody. And I think that's the key thing that we miss. And if it isn't called marketing, it's not marketing, but there are many CEOs, many directors of engineering, many directors of manufacturing, and others who are out there talking to customers all the time. That's marketing. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. There's many CIOs today who actually control all the communications between internal and external, who set up the programs and facilitate the communication channels. That's marketing. The people, as I said, who sit at your front desk are the chairman of the board. Those people are all in marketing because they're directing the whole package to bring it together into a unified whole. And so we don't think about it. And when the whole concept of, in the late 70s and early 80s, when quality became an issue in the semiconductor business, that wasn't a marketing issue. Some people thought it was a marketing. It wasn't. It was a real issue of testing and even sorting the kinds of products that you wanted. It was the kind of customers that you were using and what kind of guarantees you gave them. And so you lost business because of whether it's perception or real. It really involved getting higher up levels of credibility in your organization to have interfaces with your customers. And that solidifies it. Again, I'll use, I think in an OEM business, I think Intel did that really wonderful. I mean, Noyce and Moore and Grove were in front of customers all the time. Anytime a new product was launched, the whole executive group, Dave House, Bill Davidow, people that you know and are engaged in the museum here, they were out there talking to customers all the time and giving feedback at the executive level. And so they're in the marketing business, even though their title doesn't warrant it.
You mentioned the Mac rollout as another example. Can you talk about that? The rollout of the Macintosh.
Oh, the Macintosh. The Macintosh was planned for more than 5 years. I go back through my notebooks. I think it was launched in '85, and I think as long as about '82 was whenever I had my first meetings with Steve and his group on that. And we had regular meetings down there, at least once a week, maybe every other week, to discuss the whole package. And so it sort of took on a life of its own, objectives, goals, and so forth. And one of it was to seed the marketplace in advance. So came up with a list of, I think it was about 100 people, influential people, and it included people like Seymour Cray, and certain analysts and Ben Rosen, people like that, and they were given a Mac in advance to play with, and so that you got feedback on that, as well as they became, if they were happy, they would be, and you checked with them constantly to make sure they were happy, or that they had, if they had any need, you could adjust it, and they became references. So it's a way of sort of beginning word of mouth with the most influential people in your marketplace. And I say authors do that with books all the time. And in fact, I can remember Intuit, and when they came out with their first package, Kleiner Perkins was backing that, and I used to drive around with a trunk full of their product and just hand it out to people. And so, that is the sort of feedback loop that I think you need in order to not only keep your product relevant, but also to get feedback from where you're missing things and what you should do. And it's not a huge audience, so you're not sort of blowing everything at once. You're getting feedback and you can adapt along the way.
This is an important part of what today is called agile development, isn't it? The whole notion that you get a product, maybe the minimally viable product that represents what you want to do out there in the market, and then begin collecting feedback and refining that product. Is that taking something very traditional and sort of putting a new spin on it?
Well, there was a study, I believe it was done at Stanford, and this was maybe 20, 25, maybe even 30 years ago now, in which they compared, the Japanese software industry and the American software industry, and they said that the Japanese built a really, really good software product, but it took years and years and years, so that by the time they actually had got it to be error-free and perfect, the market had changed. Whereas American they get the product out there with the minimal amount of bugs they can, but not certainly clear of all bugs. And then they constantly send out updates, and the internet allows you to do that. So it's just one circular thing after another. I mean, I get the Microsoft email every week of changes, And I think it comes out, maybe it comes out every day, I don't know, but it's a long list of constant changes that are, and it's automatically done with your software on your system. So in effect, they're constantly increasing and improving the product while you're using it. And that system keeps America in the forefront of software. Whereas if you just build one product that you make perfect, it's probably going to fit a few people, but certainly not everybody all the time.
The people came to you because of your expertise in communications and in developing the message and the whole array of communications that a company needed to go about talking about itself and its products. But communications for you was only just one element of the whole approach to marketing. How did you adjust people's thinking when they came to you and just wanted you to do communications and help them understand that your approach was actually something different?
Well, it depends. A lot depends on the client. I mean, on how open they are to having discussions. It usually involved, several conversations with multiple layers of people, and so it just depends on how open and excited you are about them and they about you. If you feel you can work with them, then you may start doing something at one level, and then sort of move up in the organization. And that was always the challenge. I would even try to talk to my people about that. Constantly move up in the organization, because you get decisions made at the higher level that you're not going to get down 3 or 4 or 5 levels below the surface. And that's a hard thing, particularly for companies, let's say PR agencies and ad agencies and so forth. They're probably working for a vice president or even a director of marketing, or a director of marketing and a director of advertising or public relations, but they're 4 or 5 levels below the CEO. And I was fortunate in that they were all in one hat, and that was in the CEO, because we were working with so many founding companies. One couldn't have put a hat on Steve Jobs. I mean, was he the designer? Was he the marketing guy? Was he also involved in manufacturing? Yes. Was he involved in design of the product? Yes. Was he involved in speccing? Yes. I mean, he was involved in every aspect of the business, so in a way he was sort of the perfect CEO. And he was the salesman too. So I think that was true of people like Andy Grove and Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore to some extent, that they were able to talk about to the customers, not only in the technical terms, but in the application terms, and in terms of what their product could offer them and how it could change their businesses. And they were able to sell the product not just as a technical product, but of its market implications. So the microprocessor, which, the 4004 came out in about 71, but it was really the IBM business the market took off, and that wasn't until about 82, 83. So it was 10 years of looking for a market while the processor was increasing from 4-bit to 8-bit to 16-bit. And that required a change in thinking about the microprocessor within Intel. Because at first they saw it as a component, and while the customers saw it as another component. But in fact, eventually it got into, and I think people like Dave House and Bill Davidoff came in from the systems as part of the business, and they saw it differently. They saw it as getting to market faster, saving your costs, being more flexible in the functionality you can perform, being reprogrammable. So it's sort of an infinite customization. And that was a management message, not an engineering message. And so you could start selling it at the top of the company and move down, rather than start at the bottom and move up. And the microprocessor took off. And that was a time and place in which we did that consciously, is to move up and sell the product at a higher level. And that was based upon all these sort of economic and market terms, rather than on purely technical terms.
Was there an approach that you took and that you helped your people understand how to take that would move you up in a company if that wasn't where you naturally started when you first got the business?
Well, a lot of the people, at least in the early days, there's two young fellows that I hired back in the 70s, and they've stayed good friends with me, and I see them every once in a while. I've had lunch with them about a month ago. Now, one's from Portland and one's from the East Bay now, but they were just raving over the fact that as young kids, basically, I think we call them the kids, that they were working with Bob Noyce. They were working with the senior people in companies, or Steve Jobs, because it was sink or swim. I mean, I had a lot to do. I mean, we had a zillion clients banging on our doors, which was probably something that was difficult for us to handle. But to get people trained quickly, you had to actually throw them into the fire. And I think that worked well, because then they went on to get positions in which it was much higher in the organization. So the people who work for us were very often right at the forefront of working with top executives in the company, because that's who would generally call us.
I want to talk to you about how you dealt with what we've talked about this in earlier interviews, and you referred to it in your Marketing is Everything article for the Harvard Business Review, as the bias toward communications that please internal forces rather than face outward to influence market and consumer forces. How did you combat that?
Well, it wasn't easy, and oftentimes didn't succeed. There's a certain mentality in the executive level, and also I think I hate to keep dumping on the engineers, but the engineers have a mentality their product is really super, so therefore everyone should beat a path to their door, and that's not the media may or may not have any technical depth or have any perspective the way they do, and so but on the other hand, particularly through the 60s and 70s and on into the early 80s, the trade media, and then people like Business Week and or Fortune and those kind of magazines reached the executive level. You had to sort of be on customers' communication level rather than on your level, and so I used to call it engineering baby talk in many ways. But some of them were quite technical. A lot of them had were engineers themselves, and so I wrote pamphlets and articles on it, saying that they are independent. They're not advertising. They're not there to promote your product. They're there to take an honest appraisal, and they'll talk to your competitors, and they'll compare products, and they'll do those sorts of things. So it took constant sort of education. It took quite frankly, to get them, the particular of our clients, in front of the editors, so that they got an exchange of ideas from both. You could sit at a table and you could have this conversation back and forth and learn. That led to a program that we installed called Evening With program. And this is where we invited the editor of Wall Street Journal and Fortune and Time and Business Week and so forth with their boards, editorial boards, and we brought them out here. And then I would invite people from the industry, not necessarily clients, by the way, just executives, chief executives from a number of places, and it would be an open exchange. Now, this wouldn't happen today, but the rules were this: we can ask you questions and you can ask us questions in an open forum, but no stories are to be written on it.
And people observe that rule.
They observed that rule. If they wanted to do it, they could come back later and have conversations. Mrs. Graham brought out her editorial staff from the Washington Post, and which was a really great event for us, and it became well known. So other people were willing to do it, and it got an open exchange of ideas, even some debates back and forth, but everybody learned from it, and they grew to appreciate each other. Even I didn't mind if they called each other face to face. They didn't have to go through me. They didn't want to talk to me. They wanted to talk to the people directly that were involved in the company and the product. So, for me, I was facilitating that, but I wasn't necessarily had to be the intermediary.
Who were the most memorable of those evening lists, in addition to Kay Graham?
I think almost all of them were, simply because, certainly the people from Fortune were, people from Business Week, because they would ask the business and financial questions, the impact on the industry and on the market, and return on investment and other kinds of things.
And was it unusual for them to sit down and get that kind of off-the-record exposure to executives, to the top executives that you were inviting to those dinners?
Yeah. Not only that, I can tell you that the managing editor of Business Week told me, and I have this in my notebooks, they never see anybody they don't see the executives from Texas Instruments. They don't see the executives from Motorola. And we were traipsing these people back through New York all the time, and into, actually eventually into DC, into the halls of Congress, and to the analysts in New York. And so they became familiar with these people. They weren't some, West Coast crazy people which quite frankly, a lot of them really, as I said, one analyst said to me when I went out and did it on my own ahead of a tour, he said, there's only one company that we think will ever survive out of all those, and it's IBM. He said, it's the only technical company we care to cover, or we're even looking at. And that was, I think, Morgan Stanley. And he was one of their head analysts. And he said, we don't want to talk to those. But I had a press release from Intel returned to me saying, please take this off your mailing list.
As you watched, I'm sorry to go ahead and finish that thought.
Well, I'm just saying that, so their view of what was going on out here in California was sort of a renegade. And in fact, the exact quote from the analyst was, it is unlikely that any small company is going to make a major market penetration or growth happen simply because they don't have the resources. Whereas it is likely to be the division of a large company. I have this quote, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's more likely to be the division of an already existing large company because they'll have the resources and the people available to put on that product or service. So forget about those little startups out in California. And that's paraphrasing the exact phrase.
And then as these companies grew and capital and intellectual property and talent and so forth began to flood into Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s, how pervasive did that East Coast, West Coast bias remain, and how did you help your clients to overcome that?
Well, I don't think that it remained after that. I think that it started growing, particularly when the microprocessor became a reality, and the personal computer. The personal computer went on the desktops of analysts and journalists, so they were using the technology. They could now see it. Whereas if you were coming out with a linear amplifier, it's a a 3-lead kind of or 4-lead kind of chip. They couldn't identify with that. They couldn't identify with a lot of the technology that was coming out because it was invisible. It was encapsulated in something, whereas they could identify with something with a keyboard that was automatically doing things for them, and that just enhanced with the internet. They could now do real search and not just going to a particular database that you had to pay lots of money for to access, and you had to put up the codes yourself. And I mean, I did that too. And doing research, but it was very limited in the early days of the internet to be able to access things, directly and manually. But once the internet came, and all art writers, all journalists, Google, they look at everything to find the solution or find a input on, and it's not always accurate, but they then double check that by their phone calls and so forth, or emails. But it grew steadily better and better. But I think a lot of the old institutions remained quite fixed in their ways on the East Coast. And I think that's where we saw people like Digital Equipment sort of fall away when everybody thought they were going to displace IBM at one point. People like even Xerox and Kodak and companies of that sort who really weren't sort of this open to constant innovation and change and the next new, improvement in speeds and power, or reduced power, increased speeds and different technologies that enhanced their product. They didn't look for these kind of alliances. They were basically thinking they could do it themselves. And I was told by Ken Olsen, the president of DAC, the PC's not going to go anywhere. That industry doesn't have a chance. And I was told that same thing, by the way, by, the CTO at Tandem Computer that was out here. They were also selling against IBM, so they were sort of had that big computer mentality as well. The PC cannot survive. It just doesn't have the ability to see the bandwidth. It doesn't have the ability to have, multiple layers of communication, and it doesn't have the speed or the power of the memory. And they didn't even think to sort of analyze Moore's law, because Moore's law, there's one person at IBM told me there's a Moore's law for everything. The battery has a 9-year Moore's law. Every 9 years you see a new battery technology, at least at that time. So every technology is constantly improving in exponential ways. It's just the time frame that it happens. With Moore's law, it was every 18 months. And nothing, I think, had sort of met that other than DNA analysis.
Well, and when you're talking about exponential change, the difference between 18 months and 9 years is light speed,
yes,
practically.
Yeah.
And even IBM struggled. It did the PC, obviously, but it faltered a lot from time to time as this technology swept through all these businesses and industries, didn't it?
Yeah, and I think that there's a certain generational aspect to it. So I think that you would see that the newer generations at IBM had changed significantly, and that they brought in younger people out of the universities and so forth. And I was told that, for example, the second largest recruiting campus in the United States for IBM is San Jose State University, right here in Silicon Valley. I think that that keeping in touch with what's going on in both the university level and in your nearby marketplace is much easier here than it is in other places.
I want to go back now to this notion about feedback being the driver of all marketing, and couple that with the rise of consumer choice as really the ultimate market force, as you've called it. Decades ago, long before the rise of the internet, you were writing about the rise of consumer choice.
Right.
When did you first crystallize that into something that you wanted to write about and speak about and really hammer home as a component of your approach to marketing?
Well, the way the writing really came out of presentations that I had done usually on the subjects themselves, and early on, and I think part of this came from working with a few consumer companies in the 70s. One was a company called Saga Foods, and Saga had 3 restaurant chains, and they were a food service organization for universities. They were up here on Sand Hill Road. They were a huge company. They did a lot of market research and had Yankelovich doing future trends research. They gave presentations there, I think, twice a year or so. And I was invited into those presentations. And it struck me about the whole idea of social trends research. And one of the things they talked about was the diversification of products in the marketplace, probably long before it actually came about. But since I always had this whole notion that, or didn't always have it, but I had developed this whole notion that it really took mass marketing, had to have mass manufacturing first. You couldn't have a mass market without mass manufacturing. And so the technology came first. So what technologies are coming first? Well, the microprocessor, which I said was infinitely programmable. Well, as the microprocessor began using, you could start varying the output. So some of the early microprocessors, even before the personal computer, was in machine tools. So you could constantly be reprogramming the machine tools to produce different kinds of hardware and parts. And so that was out of, I think Cincinnati Millicron was one of the early users of the microprocessor. And these companies were building the circuit cards that went into the machine tools. And that was an early application. And so when you start seeing the ability to change things quickly, you start thinking about, well, mass manufacturing, the real problem there is how do you adapt it to different marketplaces? So I just started doing research in that. And some of the early ones was, I would ask people, who owns the largest market share of beer in the United States?
Market share beer?
Yeah, market share of beer.
Coors.
It's other. It's all the little microbreweries. It's all of the small, the homespun brews. And it's true with just about every product, particularly in the early phases of the marketplace. It was true with personal computers. There's still over 100 manufacturers of personal computers in the marketplace. There's over 100 manufacturers of microprocessors. Apple makes basically designs its own microprocessors and has them produced somewhere else. So the industry has been broken up into bits and pieces with different jobs being done by different independent people so that you don't have to look at this whole notion of having a company do everything here. You could have parts of it done here, parts of it done here, parts of it done, and then through logistics, bring them all together and planning. And so, being part of that, and I think we had companies in all those phases. We early on had, business in Japan. We had an office there. We had offices in Europe. And so the ability to visit so many different companies from different parts of the world and to see what technologies were going on and how this was happening, and particularly coming out of the semiconductor industry, which I think was moving faster than any other. My first 9 clients were semiconductor companies, and they were all making different kinds of semiconductors. And so you start getting with these people and the ideas, and then they were moving up a layer. So they wanted to go to the finished end product because they talked about market drivers, and the market driver was volume. So if they couldn't find volume in the military, they could find volume in the consumer business. Even the industrial marketplace was relatively small. And so that's why the first things that they started doing in the late 70s and even early 80s was calculators and watches and so forth. And that was because they thought there was a volume market there. But in many of those products, particularly in watches, they found they weren't much value add. There was not much value added in a semiconductor and a watch because people were looking at it as a cosmetic thing, not an electronic piece. And so, it was this learning process and the whole aspect of being curious about things. How does that work? So I do a lot of research, and I always have, I still do. I have a folder on just about every subject imaginable, because when it was just magazines and newspapers, I was a ferocious clipper, and I still have files and files and files of everything from soup to nuts on technologies or on markets or on whatever.
It's fascinating to me that you started that story with a food company.
Yeah.
What light bulb went on? You mentioned you were already working in market research, and they were using Yankelovich and so forth, but what light bulb went on working for them and thinking about consumer choice as a driver that was new for you at the time?
Well, it was the customization of products, right? It was the EEPROM. You could erase it and start over again. You could constantly refresh it.
Yeah.
It was microprocessor. It was infinitely programmable, and so you could keep changing the application or changing the output to suit whatever application you had or function you wanted to. And so and having worked with Intel, this kind of constant conversation of trying to think through what is the value of the microprocessor to our customers. And there was meetings every week on this. through, through almost 10 years. And again, when I go through my notebooks, it's always, what is a microprocessor? What does it do? What are its benefits? And gradually they change from sort of a functional kind of description to an economic kind of discussion, and to a productivity discussion. And then that formed into presentations to customers, and that's where it started to take off. So I sort of lived through that experience thanks to Intel.
It really obliterated the distinction between a business-to-business type of business and made everything a business-to-customer.
Yeah, I mean, everything ultimately is a service now, right? I mean, it's one manufacturer is now a service to someone else, and so everything is this cross network of services. And that's, I mean, I suspect more money spent on logistics today than just about anything.
I want to talk a bit now about, with that all firmly established, this rise of consumer choice is an important component of your approach to marketing, the rise of the internet and how the internet really unleashed that. How did you first come to experience the internet and its likely, still undemonstrated, but likely interest on your customers and on your business itself?
Well, again, the internet, I had experienced a couple interfaces. Some was obviously through our clients. One of the first modem manufacturers out of Georgia, I forget the name right now, but they were the largest modem manufacturer. And so, that was a dial-up modem. And so, our offices were filled with these dial-up modems. And so the first thing you want to do is to sort of automate that. You're unhappy with that. I also, BBN back in Boston became a client at some point. And I actually went on their board. And that sort of helped it. I was sort of always experimenting myself with it. I put in a high-speed line, cost me a fortune, into my home, and so that was very expensive. They had to run cables to do it, but I had my own sort of high-speed network at home, and played with it constantly. And so it wasn't that I knew the technology of it, but I was searching for things, trying to get answers, all of that sort of thing. And I think it was just the kinds of clients we had who were all sort of moving in that same direction, and you heard a lot about it. As those innovations came about, I mean, for example, my email, which is my name .com, Regis@regis.com. I have when Internet was providing a clearance for your registration. That was before the clearinghouse on it. And so I was sued by Regis hair salons and other people to try to they actually shut us down for a while until I showed them that, we preceded all of that stuff. And I think it was our own willingness. And one of the things I used to try to tell our employees, we're like a high-tech company. We're not another sort of PR agency, not another sort of promotional agency that's here to implement someone else's ideas. We're here to create our own ideas and to constantly innovate. And so we try to come up with new products, basically new services, which we had a long list of. And we try to have everybody as automated as possible. Within their office, we hired someone to network our office for as soon as possible. In fact, the guy who did it was the guy who originally was working on the landing module on Mars, and so he did all of our networking at the office. And this was, I think, in the early '80s or mid '80s rather. It was the curiosity. It was the working with clients that are pushing ahead to the next sort of openness and expansion, and using the model that we want to be like our clients. We don't want to simply be another manufacturer. We want to be innovator. And that came with the tools that you use. And out of that, I was able to find a lot of really good people who enjoyed doing that as well. And in any company, there's a core group of people that do that, and we were the same. We had a core group of people who were the drivers.
Were the business opportunities for your existing clients and for clients who were coming into the internet space on their own, were those immediately apparent, or when did they first become really apparent to you?
Well, you never know, right? I mean, this is why, at least half, maybe 2/3 of all startups fail. And yet they're backed by venture capital. I mean, if anybody could foresee the future, I always say the tipping point is only seen in a rear view mirror, right? And so you don't know when they first came out. I mean, you think it might work. I mean, this is why people would look at Apple and say, it's sort of like, why didn't I buy AT&T stock back in the 20s? My father used to say that, he had a chance, or maybe before that. Why didn't people just gobble up all of Intel or Apple stock or those sorts of things early? Because they would have known what they became. But they didn't know what they were going to become. And so it was a work in progress. And, I think Leslie Berlin put that in her book, that everybody was experimenting. Everybody was one page ahead of the next person. And so you sort of felt your way along, you experimented, and you moved forward. And so, and I'm reflecting back, everything was sort of an experiment. And as Bob Noyce once told me that, I told him once that, over half of Silicon Valley companies fail. I read a study on that. We were on an airplane, and he said to me, maybe more should fail. And I was kind of taken back by it. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, when you fail, it means you're trying new things. And he said, so if more companies fail, it means they're trying new things. And I think that's you just have to keep recovering and make sure that no failure is catastrophic. And it can nearly come to that at times, yes. And it does for a lot of companies and a lot of our clients. So when people say, which clients follow you, well, they do for a period of time, but then they may not always because of other factors, because of, the product plan didn't work, the product failed, all sorts of reasons, bad management. There's just all sorts of reasons why companies succeed and fail. And it's very hard to predict that in the future, looking forward, if not impossible.
Right. Let's turn now to your ideas about branding, especially about what a brand is and what it isn't. First of all, talk about, I love to hear your explanation, which we've talked about in other settings, about what people perceive a brand to be versus what you really believe the definition of the word brand means. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, first of all, I'll start with, sort of my concept of brand. And brand by definition has to have a history, right? And so I always say that it's not the first product that they buy, it's the second one that's important. That means that there's a history there. You had some experience and you're going to buy it again. So you have to have a history. That history isn't an ad. It isn't a data sheet. It isn't a spec. It's something real in which it's tangible, in which the consumer experience. So the consumer experience has to be somewhat consistent over time for you to have a brand. And to have a national brand or have a huge brand, you have to have that consistent. Now, there's lots of, $100 million, several $100 million product advertising that goes on, and yet we, half of all products that are introduced into the marketplace fail. I mean, and so I had this debate once with the ad agency from IBM, and back in New York, a woman who was representing IBM's ad agency, and she was arguing about their brand and IBM brand and so forth. And I said, so what happened to PC Junior? Because the brand's so wonderful. And also I was in a debate with the woman who was marketing for Martha Stewart. And I said, putting your whole thing behind one name is tenuous and it could be chancy. And she says, no, not Martha. She's sort of up there on a pedestal. And that was before she went to prison. Now, I'm not castigating her for that. I think there was maybe other circumstances that went on that we're trying to use her as an example. But in fact, things do happen, and you have to, with brand, that change it very quickly overnight. A new competitor, we saw that some of the most established brands in the United States were quickly wiped out, even in semiconductors when the Japanese entered with a higher quality product or cheaper prices. And so I started thinking that branding is, the term branding and what it means is relative to the economy, to the availability of choice, to the who's manufacturing it, all sorts of social circumstances of people. So, for example, in a recessionary time or in a down market time, people will buy cheaper cars. They will buy cheaper clothes. They will buy things that are more on sale. They're less concerned about the brand than about just replacing things or getting something that's convenient or conventional. And so brand is relative to what's going on around you. It's not, so it's constantly changing in my mind. It's not still. And I think that when the second big thing about brand is it never fails that whenever you say, I need to get a new brand or I need to refurbish our brand, what do? The first thing people start doing is giving you a new logo, a new slogan. They change the colors, they run ads, they do that sort of thing. And that's not where your brand comes from. It comes from the product or the service that you're offering. And so many times it may require you redoing your product or changing your product or coming out with new product. Steve Jobs, when he went back to Apple, most people don't realize that it took him over 2 years to get back online with Apple. And he ran these wonderful ads that was, I'm forgetting the series that he did, but it was a very good advertising that he put on television. But the brand, their market share didn't change at all. It was something like 3 or 4%, and it was still 3 or 4% after they ran that ad campaign. It changed when he came out with those new color Macs.
The jelly beans.
The jelly beans Macs, yeah.
Them, yes.
That changed because those sold like hotcakes, and it got them back into a profitability. And profitability is your number one marketing tool in my mind in this business. If you're profitable, then it means you're doing something right, and your competitors know it, the analysts know it, the world knows it. If you're doing if you start faltering in your profitability, then your competitors are like, the prey waiting for you to limp. They become predators, and so people begin questioning your rationale, your strategy. The CEO's generally job is on the line. And if he's not the chief marketing officer, why do CEOs lose their positions whenever the market goes awry for them? And I think that they're the first ones to go. And so I think that I think the brand we don't understand very well. We just want to automatically label it with something, and it creates a huge industry of people creating logos and slogans and brands, but they're not really contributing to the value of the company, in my mind.
How did you approach it when someone came to you and said, we want to change our brand, or we want a campaign that repositions the company? That's a phrase that you frequently hear in business, and I'm sure you must have heard that all
Right.
the time. What's the nature of the conversation you would have?
Well, it's a little bit, I would use it differently in those cases. I mean, from a branding standpoint, when somebody says we need a new brand or we need to change the brand, I think that's extremely complex, particularly in today's marketplace. I mean, I think that you probably have to spend, and I don't know what the numbers are now, but I would say to get a national brand or even an international brand, I think you have to spend about $500 million to really establish that over maybe a couple year, 2 or 3 year period. To reposition a company depends upon, for example, and I've used this slogan with my clients, or this phrase, you're judged by the company you keep, something your mother told you. And that is, what are your alliances? Who are your distributors? Who are your channels? Who are your suppliers? Who are all the people that you rely on to get your product to market? Who are your developers? For example, if you're hardware and you're trying to get software developers, who are the key developers? And I think this is why the IBM brand grew, because the Mac didn't have the developers that moved over to the IBM because they had the volume. So the volume on their product drew the developers shifted from Mac to IBM, and Apple was left with very small space on the shelves in most of the retail shops. And so to change your position, I felt you had to do something really radical. And it's why I started pitching in my first presentation. First time I wrote an outline for the marketing plan in 1976 for Apple. I put retail stores, and I made 2 or 3 presentations over the years to the executive staff on that. And I kept feeling that they had to have their own outlets, because you weren't going to have some third party give the demonstrations that you need to give, which the kinds of products Apple was created required a demonstration. This is why Steve and the way he stood up and he showed you the product, he showed you how they work. People now stood up. That started back with the Mac 2. And it was this whole notion that they're complex products, they need demonstration. And you don't have the money to do it on television, so you create this sort of influential group that you pull together, and you may have to do it around the country, which we did do.
And you were always an advocate for live product demonstrations.
Yeah, and that's just from reading Marshall McLuhan. That's just from reading about the media. This is reading, about what television did for you, but you didn't have television because you didn't have the resources to spend money on television those early days.
Yeah. So
that created this sort of show me, and Steve was a good showman, and he I always said when Steve was showing you a product, he was lost. He loved those products that he was working on, and he really did have the enthusiasm in here that he was putting out to the audience. And so I think that's how Apple got its repositioned in the marketplace around products that were more sophisticated and that looked harmless to use, but you weren't quite sure. Because in the early days of the personal computer, the first question anybody asked is, what personal computer should I buy? Everybody was asking that question in the early 80s. I used to ask large audiences, how many of you have asked the question, what person? No, all the audience would raise their hand because they were insecure about buying a computer. It just had that sort of IBM-ish, sort of big computer kind of thing. What do I do with it? And so you would reference friends, just like you would a physician. So it became a reference selling system in those early days. And that changed their position in the marketplace from being sort of a wild little hair down here in Silicon Valley to becoming a serious computer company.
What are some of your other favorite success stories, Regis, on clients that you had where you worked with the idea of a brand tied to a product, and building those two things simultaneously into real success stories?
Well, I mean, probably a number of them, though. As I mentioned, we had a lot of clients over the years, and if half the startups in Silicon Valley were failing, a lot of our companies were failures in the long run. They don't always become clients in the long run. I think the two long run clients for us were Apple and Intel, and that was between 20 and 25 years as a client. I mean, that's a long term, particularly through several managements and so forth. But most of the clients were short term. I mean, 4 to 5 years maybe, or longer. Genentech was probably 3 or 4 years. Most biotech companies, and we had a fair amount of those, they don't really want you for the marketing of the product, because that's really a specialty of getting FDA approval, getting through certain channels, getting partners, and so forth. But knowing that process with Genentech, one of the first things we did was to get the information out in the national business media, even before we were supposed to, because they're supposed to have peer reviews on all of that, and I got beat up by a number of people in the pharmaceutical industry for releasing this before the peer reviews. But I felt we're sort of renegades out here on the West Coast, so let's act like one. And got pretty detailed articles on what it was and what it did in both Business Week and the Wall Street Journal. That led to a call from Lilly, who owned 80% of the insulin market. And then Lilly came out, visited them, and then they ended up licensing that product. It became Novolog, which is the human-engineered, like human insulin, engineered in almost a distillery kind of process, rather than extracted from pigs and cows' pancreas, which was a long, cumbersome, and costly process. So Genentech got onto the map very quickly just by saying, let's get out there to the business marketplace, rather than go up through sort of the science, trade journals, and so forth. Let's go out and start at the top, and that led to a major deal that put them on the map. Certainly spectrophysics, but that goes back to the 70s, in which they were a wonderful company because they were some of the early laser companies. They were one of the first laser companies here in the Valley. And I can remember, we introduced the first laser. It was, I think, $100, which brought it down to the consumer level. And then it started showing up in scanners in the supermarket. And then both NCR and National Semiconductor produced the supermarket checkout systems. They were a client. And in fact, Dave Martin was the president of National Advanced Systems. He's on the Computer History Museum's board. And Dave was a client very early on, and working on trying to get National to compete in that area. But the guts of that was scanning the UPC codes. And by the way, this all ties together because that enabled grocery stores to go from 5,000 products on the shelves to 10 to 20 to 30 to 50 to 100, and now, hundreds of thousands of products, simply because you could inventory them quickly. You had just-in-time inventory, so you didn't have to keep them in the back closet. You could keep them in a warehouse somewhere and have just-in-time delivery come every day and just supply directly the shelves. All of that process came about because of laser scanning and because of computing technology. And without that, and we were in the parts of it because we were working with the companies that were making that equipment. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's exactly what we set out to do, was in early days of spectrophysics, and I can read this in my notebooks now, that the markets we looked at were scanning. And that was for a low-cost laser. And, as that happened, it all sort of unveiled itself in front of our eyes. Other clients, well, for various, segments, I'm going to lose sight of some of these, but I think actually even more recently there's was a company called Golden Gate Software that, well, first of all, there was a company called WebLogic, which was a Java server. They created a product, a Java server, and this was a little startup in San Francisco. And I gave them their first check to sort of get out their manuals and things like that. and got on their board and helped bring in the CEO and raise money and so forth. And that was sold to BEA for about a third of BEA, which was an established company. I don't know if they were over $1 billion. And so that made them a high value. And then once it was sold, then BEA stock split, I think, 3 times. And so if you held on to your stock, you did very, very well. Well, the president of WebLogic was a guy named Ali Kutay. And Ali was ran the software programs for the manufacturing at Lockheed. He was a young guy out of CMU, and out of Pittsburgh. And I met him actually in Japan, but started doing things for him at Lockheed. I tried to get Lockheed to spin out their software products, and they didn't want to do that. And so basically I recruited Ali to come and be the president of WebLogic. And then he did well there, and then he became the CEO of a company called Golden Gate Software, which was a sort of a high-speed backup system for across multiple platforms, software programs and hardware programs. And that was a very successful thing, and it was based upon a book I wrote called Real Time. So everything they promoted was, real-time processing. And they've now on their third company, the same team, and they still use the terms real-time. So it's now it's streaming, but it's real-time inline processing and analytics done while it's streaming. And that's been sort of their model since the 90s, late 90s. And over 3 generations of companies and pretty much the same senior management level that's just moved from company to company. The last 2 companies they had were bought by Oracle. So they've done very well. There's really a lot of companies. I mean, as I was doing my list, I started writing them down, and it got to be a long, long list of companies that we work for, hundreds.
We have, as part of this, we'll be including that Excel spreadsheet, which I'm sure is not complete, but it's got hundreds of companies on it, and of course some names that were and still are exceptional. I want to talk about just by virtue, this is one last question as we finish this section, just by virtue of their unique leadership and their commercial success and their longevity, were the executives you worked with at Intel and Apple the most impactful just in terms of the way that you saw this marriage between product and marketing play out over decades, not just years, but decades?
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think more Intel than Apple, because Apple came later, and also because you learned so much from Intel. There really wasn't time not to learn, because you were learning all the time. It was, I think Intel introduced about, I'm guessing, but somewhere between 70 and 80 products or product-related activities a year. It's just product after product after product. They were always trying new things. Some of them failed. Bubble memory was a big failure, and they put a lot of effort behind that. The large-scale mainframe on a chip, they spent a lot of money, and that was not successful. Though Andy Grove later told me that what they really learned from that was to develop design tools. So for these very large VLSI devices, they had to have design tools, and so by working on that project, they had to redesign their design tools, and so that helped them with future generations. So you're just constantly learning from these people. But Intel was an intense, very smart people, driven by the product managers. They had about, I think it was somewhere in maybe 10 different product lines that we were working with between Portland and Phoenix and here and Europe. We did work, so we had offices in all their locations. You were always, sort of forced to innovate yourself and come up with new ways of thinking about it. It was always also a struggle because, particularly when we had an advertising business, their ideas on advertising and mine were 180 degrees out of the loop, because theirs was much more, show a picture of the product and spec, and mine was much more use analogies, colorful. We used third-party artists and so forth. I mean, we with spectrophysics, I used artwork from Jean Follon, Folon. I mean, he's a French artist. It's in most of the modern museums of art have his works. And he did illustrations for us, and I licensed them, and got to know him quite well. And he, by the way, just an anecdote, he's the first one that we tried to hire to do the Macintosh themes. And in fact, on my desk is a little button that says Mac on it, and it's one of his little characters that he had on it. So, and finally he just had to turn it down because he got so busy doing, he was an artist that did set designs. He did illustrations for he saw no limits to art. It could be a magazine cover. It could be an annual report cover. It could be on a theater stage. It could be, so he didn't have these sort of barriers that I got to be in fine art museums or I'm not an artist. He stretched the boundaries, and he did a lot of silk screens on aluminum and those kinds of really fantastic stuff. And so we used artists, if we could, to really make a difference, to say, hey, your technology is unique. It ought to be out there on the edge of the mainstream, and what you're doing in your ad is reflecting that into your products and your company. And the audience got it, but a lot of times the engineers didn't.
You've returned to this. I'm going to return to this theme just for a minute about working with engineers and working with non-engineers. That's not an easy line to straddle, and yet you've straddled it your whole career. What made you successful in being able to do that where so many people?
Well, I don't mean to dump on engineers, actually. I mean, I think they're I learned so much from them.
It's well known. You wouldn't be the first to say it,
No,
even if you said it.
I know that, but I think it also becomes a little bit of a cliche, to say that, because there are certainly engineers that are well-read. There are engineers that
of course.
I can remember, talking about, who was it? I was talking about somebody, I don't know, I'm going to use a name, but it's not that one. So I was talking to a group of engineers about somebody like, it was something like Picasso, and they said, what company does he work for, So I think he was being facetious, but there are other times in which there was a fellow at National who ran manufacturing who was quite astute in modern art. And so, it's just that in terms of,
it's more the marketing side.
Yeah,
of it
it's
that
more
I'm
the
interested,
practicality of it.
Yeah.
And there's so much, I think, the feedback, if it's negative, they sort of shrivel up a bit. So at Intel, if they heard some noise coming from the upper level, and in fact, I know that some of the marketing VP would say to me, the executive staff doesn't like that, the feeling that they could shake you. And I sort of would shrug. I mean, then fire us, if they don't like it. And I had many arguments with Andy Grove over that, who you don't argue with. He once told me in the parking lot at Intel that he could save a lot of money at Intel if he would fire us. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, the engineers are arguing over your ads in the hallways. He said, if we fired you, they wouldn't be arguing, they'd get some work done. And so, I think that you want to at least be out there with people talking about it. You want to be different, and not different for different sake, but if it has a reflection on things, then I think it's worthwhile. And, but I sold that business fairly early. A lot of reasons because of that. Because I was trying to always sort of move up the ladder. And the next thing was doing what we called market relations rather than PR. We called it MR. And it included all the segments of the market, from from the media, which is communications, but also analysts and partners and distributors and salespeople and whatever was in that intermediary between the company and the marketplace, or reflected on that. Then all of those were included in this idea of market relations, and we kept building on that until the time when we sort of get out of more of the implementation into the pure strategy consulting. But that took, 20 years.
I want to get back now into how you took your approach to marketing from the role of executing, actually doing the work, which was so much of the early part of your company, to more of strategic advising and talking to companies about not just marketing, but the whole arc of the company at that level. Two questions. When did you decide that you really wanted to make that change? And then how did you go about doing it?
Well, I think, again, it was sort of the pattern of following in the footsteps of the technology companies around, and that is to sort of integrate forward. And what you found is that the implementation, particularly when you're talking about things like advertising or the media, the thinking that goes behind it is not valued. It's what they're looking at. So there was a time when a press release you could do for a couple $100. But what people didn't see was the meetings that you had in determining not only what the product was going to be, what the pricing was going to be. Usually the pricing took lots and lots of negotiation before they would go out with it. And so you had these long internal discussions about how are we going to announce it, do we get it into our key customers first? So you'd go through weeks and weeks of having, before you launched a product, even though, you put out this little piece of paper that had a few words on it, and you might charge them a lot of money for it based on the time you put in on that product or on that service, but it didn't equal what the output was.
Even that still didn't equal
Even
it.
that didn't, no. And even, and we increased our prices. We were pretty expensive, but on the other hand, that's what you heard was, you're really expensive, and...
Did that bother you?
No, I said, fine, find a replacement. I have said that. And I think that, I don't think they could have found that because by then I had, a really good staff of technical writers and people who could sit down and write their articles and their speeches and everything else. So we had a pretty good staff of people that could do services that not too many other, in fact, almost nobody in this area could do. And nor did they know the company as well and history as well. The other value that I think that got me to do a lot of this was working for so many different companies. So you could sit in meetings at Intel, and then you go over to Apple, but then you might go up to Genentech. Then you might go over to Memorex, which is something completely different. Then you might go to Spectrophysics, which is a laser company. And then you might go to something else. So you were constantly moving across these boundaries that in some point we're going to have common interests, but by and large in that area you were just learning something different about all of the various elements that come together, all the pieces of the Rubik's Cube. And that is what adds up to being able to give some advice, because you see what works and what doesn't work. It was night and day going to a meeting at Intel, and a management meeting with all of the senior management in, and going to a senior management meeting at Apple. It was just night and day, because Apple was was largely dominated by one person. Steve was very dominant in those meetings. There was other inputs, and there was a lot more sort of arguing over things. Whereas Intel, there was more working toward a common goal. There might have been disagreement, but it wasn't. It was never sort of isolating to the individual or to the point. They wanted you to sort of put up your arguments, but the better you did that, the more they could justify what they were saying, or put it against some opposition, and so I felt that Intel was sort of almost the perfect place to have an education. And I would say that most of the executives that I know, even today, who worked at Intel through the 80s, will tell you it was the best learning experience of their life. There was process, everybody was smart, everybody was moving, everybody had, sat down and looked at their goals, objectives, and deliverables, and so forth. And it seemed to me that the one thing was a changing point in which I was sitting in a meeting, and we had done a lot of research on a particular company. And in that same meeting, they had brought in some McKinsey people. And the McKinsey people were taking notes on our presentations. And I thought, here they are making, I don't know, $500 an hour, and we're making, $200 an hour. And somehow or other, it's only perception.
And perhaps a lot of what you were saying in that meeting was going to somehow get incorporated into some future McKinsey advice to its clients.
By the way, that was true with a lot of the analysts. I can tell you, where analysts would call me and ask, opinions on things, and I'd see it in their annual reports and those kind of things, simply because we had a perspective. And so it wasn't that I was sort of making this up out of my own mind. I was doing it based upon these meetings and sessions and so forth, and and I was in constant movement. I was showing. Did I show you my calendar at all?
You did.
Yeah, you saw my calendar, what it looked like. I was just from, one company to the next company to the next company, and just constant movement. And so you absorb a lot, and if you're curious, you then go home and do more homework, and. So the ability to say, hey, I can offer you something in terms of perspective and advice. And quite frankly, the longer you're around, the more they want that. And so, I get asked for now for all kinds of things in terms of advice and opinions and so forth that I would never have been asked, 30 years ago, simply because I've been around a long time and people want your perspective. That was one of the key points that I remember very clearly, is saying, we've got to step up one and sort of get rid of the argumentative points, which was having people redo the implementation tool rather than get back to the basics. And what changes a company isn't the ad, or it isn't the press release. What changes a company is the fundamental strategy that goes behind all that. What is the company doing to establish itself in the marketplace? And that's a variety of things, not only in terms of product planning and partners and channels and alliances and finances and profitability. I can tell you that, how many times I've told a company that wanted us to reposition themselves, and I told them the most valuable thing is your financials. And so once you become profitable, you'll see things change. So the first task isn't to, I remember telling Steve that when he went back to Apple, and get profitable, because no one's going to take you seriously unless you can stand behind, you have your profitability to stand behind it. And so all of these factors have to come together, and it takes thinking about all those factors, and you see them when they fall apart in one place, or are doing well in another place, or not doing quite right in one place or another. So it becomes a question of, and one of the reasons I kept notebooks was for reflection on all of that. And so having gone through those notebooks in the last month, I'm not quite done yet, but I've probably gone through 100 notebooks to date, and you can almost see that sort of happening in terms of being able to go into different meetings and different things and suddenly start writing down your reflections rather than just what's going on in the meeting.
And since you were already doing that work, that strategic work, increasingly, I can see what the desire was to flip the whole company up, if you will, or to make a whole major change so that a major concentration of the focus of the business was at the strategic level and less at the execution level. How did that work in practice, though? I mean, is it just something that you were able to do gradually over time, or was it
No. I sold off the advertising in 1981, and I sold off what we would call the public relations site in 1995 to the people, to the employees who wanted to do that, and so I was left with a business that we had to build ourselves, and it turns out that a lot of that came from larger companies that were not necessarily startups. They weren't necessarily willing to do that. Some venture people would have me go in and talk to their companies or meet with them and do some advising.
At a strategic level.
At a strategic level. And I did that quite a bit. But, companies like AT&T, Semiconductor, I did a trip to Japan for them. NCR, I did a world tour with them on announcing a new technology. IBM became a very large client of ours on their mid-range computer systems and services, and Almaden Labs and companies like that. These bigger companies who needed sort of outside input, more objective views of what they were doing, and maybe they just didn't want to pay the larger consulting firms, but we were still a bargain, and we had a ton of experience with technology, ton of experience. All of our people had come out of, by then most of our people had come out of the technology businesses. That's where we were hiring them, either, and a lot of them went back into that. So I felt that we had something to offer, but it was gradual. You just can't jump into it. You have to sort of build the resume, and the resume becomes building some companies you've done work for, and references, and that happened from roughly the beginning of probably the 90s. And up through probably 2005, we had a really good consulting group. A lot of good, sharp young people. Several of them are now started their own technology companies. They're very successful. A couple are in venture capital, and some are still just doing individual consulting. So, and I keep in touch with a lot of them. So. That from the 90s to about 2005, we just had a really good group of consulting type people who could go out and get business. I think up to that point, you were trying to make people do from this side over to this side. It didn't work very well. A lot of these people didn't not only want to do it, they didn't know how to do it. They thought they did, and a lot of them emulated it, but they weren't that successful at it, because you do have to be able to kind of pull out show your gray hair and show that you've been around and done some things. A lot of the people experiences were more in the promotional area than in the actual strategy area.
Well, and in practical terms, even beyond that, you have to have done it. I mean, it's an expertise and a capability born of first just the experience of having done it so much, but then Also, I think in your case, Regis, it's this ability to synthesize so many different inputs that any business requires. You've talked about all the internal things, but then all the external things, and your capacity, which you've been doing by that point over decades, of just pulling all of those different perspectives together.
Yeah, the thing that I often told people was people are unwilling to do the homework. And it does take a lot of homework, you know, I mean, and prep work. You know, for this meeting, I got about 6 pages of notes, right, that I do on my own. So I may not look at them, but I at least, you know, thought about them. And you really have to do that. And even some references go back and look at other things you've done or whatever. But you also have to just, now you go online, but in those days you wanted to talk to a lot of people that you knew in the industry who might have an opinion on it. You know, I think there's a lot of people that just honestly don't want to hear the truth. In many circumstances, I've certainly had that happen a lot. They don't want to hear actually the real truth about
Meaning what's actually happening
Yeah.
in their business and
Yeah.
with their customers.
Yeah. They are sure that it's not their fault. And I can think of 3 very prominent companies that you would know that basically did that.
At a moment when they were in trouble as companies, you were delivering news they didn't want to hear.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one that I could tell you about is Segway. And I felt, I never really was comfortable with the machine. John Doerr had me come in and talk to them, and I felt that they should have licensed off to all the technology and sort of got out of the business, because I didn't think it would ever have the value that they put into it. I mean, they put something like $1 or $2 billion into it, and it wasn't the revolution that it was purported to be. Yeah, it's used in segments now, but it certainly isn't the. And my answer to this is, how would you like to see 1,000 of those things going down Fifth Avenue, New York? If it's going to become a mass transportation tool, as they said it was going to be, then you have to expect that every sidewalk in New York would be covered with them, and that wasn't going to happen. So, you know, and they did find it hard to sell the product, and they even put it on Amazon. And you know, when I talked to the founders, I don't think they wanted to hear that. I don't think, I know that, you know, companies like DEC, when I went out and did research with the CIOs, I don't think they wanted to hear that research, because they had done their yearly survey. And that's all that they really needed to see whether, are you happy or you're unhappy? You know, check the box. Whereas we had conversations with them. And so, you know, and I think that, or for that matter at Apple, when I made the presentation to Gil Amelio, he didn't want to hear that presentation.
This was the presentation on how to fix Apple.
Yeah.
Which they'd asked you to come and
No,
do,
they
hadn't
didn't. They didn't. I've called them and said that at the time we had a partner, Gemini, which was a large international consulting firm. And so I had a partner from Gemini, and I worked on it. And, you know, went in and made this presentation to him about how to fix it. And it started with, you know, looking at the financials, looking at...
Which at that point were really bad.
Really bad. And it had to do with partnerships. It had to do with creating some models to start emulating, cutting costs. I mean, some of the basic stuff to get back and to do, you know, product reviews. And as it turns out, you know, Steve sort of came in and did it by fiat. I mean, he just came in and wiped out a lot of the projects that were going on, because they would have 3 or 4 projects all doing the same thing and overlapping and competing with one another. And Steve came in and said there's going to be, you know, 3 groups. There's going to be the iPad, the iPhone, and what else? You know, the computer. And he said, and all of you are going to work for one of those 3 groups, and you won't be fighting anymore, you'll all be working for the same objectives. Makes sense, you know? Very simple. But if you had people who had come out of big companies, and there was a lot of IBM people that were brought in at that time, you know, they could have 20 projects going in parallel and pick the one that won in the competition. And you can't afford that in a company that's struggling to survive. So,
which company, I'm thinking about this period now from 95 to 2005, after you made this whole repositioning to do market advising, strategic advising. Which companies were the most important to you during that time? Which ones did you think took to your style and your advice the best, that you really enjoyed working for, maybe had the best leadership, so that, you know, the whole package came together and you really felt like your vision for what you wanted the company to do and you wanted to do personally matched their needs and reactions?
Well, I think it was a team of people, for one thing, and I mentioned them before, and this was the teams that Ali Couttet had put together. And it was 3 different companies, and I'm still on his current company's board, so I have a long time history with them. I know the people. The engineers are really wonderful people, the people that do the software, and have become sort of very close friends. They've taught me a lot. And I think that also through that period we had something, I'm not sure it was in that same, I think it was pretty much in the same thing. It was certainly in the mid-90s to further was Microchip, which is a microcontroller company out of Phoenix. Might have been a little bit earlier, but Microchip was sort of a company that had gone under bad management and was sort of had a factory but no management, and there was a young guy there named Steve Sanji who was sort of down the ranks and who was a very sharp guy and just sort of assumed responsibility for improving the manufacturing bit by bit, and making it happen even with, you know, old equipment and so forth, getting good quality products out. And the board finally, you know, turned it over to him. And that was, the board was me, Don Valentine, Pierre Lamond, and a few other people. He just did a marvelous job, and quarter after quarter, he was improving everything. And that company, I think if you were to talk to the analysts in that world, they would say that Microchip was one of their star pupils over the last 20 years. They had gone for at least most of those years without losing a cent, quarter-to-quarter profitability. Their stock price remained high even during the down recession. And the same is true of Linear Technology. Linear Technology, I was on the original board of that, and they were all friends of mine who spun out of National. And Bob Swanson, same name that founded Genentech, Bob Swanson, 2 Bob Swansons. And Bob was a linear engineer there, and he put together a company that competed with National and TI and all of the other, and Fairchild, all of the linear companies. But again, through unique design and quality products and customer, paying attention to customers, both Microchip and them paid attention against the customers. And I used to say, you may never have heard of them, but their customers have heard of them, and they keep repeating their orders because they keep growing. And the analysts in those fields know them. And quite frankly, from a brand standpoint, they are an outstanding brand. And you know, I can tell you I've never sold the share of either of them. And I've had it for, 20 years. And it's still worth a lot of money. It's valuable. And I think those 2 companies really are outstanding in the time frame. Actually, IBM became a very good client to ours during those periods. Jack Keeler became president of IBM, and Jack Keeler was a graduate of Santa Clara University. He was also the only engineer to become president. Most of them were marketing people, including the founders of IBM. They were all out of the sales and marketing. but Jack was he was sort of the engineer's engineer. The engineers really loved him there, and they admired him greatly. And he was just a fine individual. So I was sitting at a board meeting at Santa Clara, and I had come out with a book called Who's Afraid of Big Blue? And it was about all these little companies that were nibbling away at IBM, the Compaqs and the Apples and the digital equipment and other types of companies that basically were taking little pieces out of their hide. And it wasn't another, they used to say it was the, what they call them, the UNIVAC, the bunch. Burroughs, instead of the B-U-N-C-H, UNIVAC, and I forget but there was 5 companies that were big companies that they say were always competing with IBM, and those were the ones who they looked out, they were supposed to look to compare to. But in fact, it was all these little companies that were actually starting up that were taking bits and pieces by innovating new products in that area and new technologies. And so I come out with this book, and I was sitting beside this woman, and I was talking to her, and I don't know, we got off onto something, and I mentioned something about, she had asked me some questions. I don't know how we got into it, but I had mentioned something about IBM or something, and she said, well, yes, well, Jack Keeler's my husband. And I said, that Jack Keeler? She said, yes. So I knew of him, but I didn't know him. And he was there, and so we got introduced, and he invited me back to Armonk, and we got to be pretty good friends. And then one of the things, his goal was to actually create these alliances with Apple, which came about. They created 2 joint ventures with Apple. This is after Steve left. And he was hoping to sort of work together with them to create these new technology ventures that were joint investment and joint operations by both companies. I think the disconnect was pretty obvious, and they didn't last long, maybe 5 years or more, but not long. And some of the best people in engineering and that were working on them. But Jack and I became fairly good friends, and he introduced me to a lot of people at IBM. And so that got us into meeting people and talking, and I gave some talks back there and to different groups. I used to give talks to IBM customers at Almaden Labs, because once a year they would bring in their top customers to see what was going on in the labs. And then I was invited to give talks at those. And that led one thing to another, to where we ended up with a fairly sizable piece of business with them. I think that went till the recession, to the cutback, in which everybody cut out all consulting firms, and so it hurt us badly. But I felt they were very open. I mean, I was invited into a lot of top-notch sessions, and with the engineers and so forth, got to meet a lot of them. Got to meet the fellow that wrote the original programs for the mainframes, and I'm trying to think of his name now. There was, forget him now. I think he wrote the book, The Mythical Man
Mythical
Month.
Man Month, yeah.
And spent some time in meetings with him and so forth. So I mean, they have really brilliant people, lots of really deep thinking going on about human interface and the nature of technology and society. It was for me, it was a wonderful learning experience, and it was largely the people. And I think, and then it was a lot of different things. We worked on a major product introduction out of Xerox in the East. That was both good and bad. I got to work with, his name was Paul Lair, he was president, and they were going to build this humongous printing machine that was 20 or 30 feet long, and could put paper in this end, and a book would come out this end, and that sort of thing. And it was at the era of the digital technology was coming into the mainstream, and they were advertising the document company, which was spending millions and millions of dollars on advertising that on national television. And I told them they should make it the digital document company, and that they should put that machine behind a wall somewhere and just put a little hole in the one side and a hole coming out the other, and don't even show them the machine and things like that. And but the whole process and the whole introduction and that we worked on and helped them. And but I think it was a difficult and a struggle. Did some work with digital equipment, with Boule, who was the largest computer manufacturer in France. And I actually sat down with them and Honeywell when they did Honeywell bought them. And I was sort of the go-between. And they came and negotiated out in my conference room with me. Olivetti, Philips, did work with Philips. Gave seminars back in Eindhoven.
So these were big strategic relationships,
Right.
and people relying on you for all kinds of additional strategic advice beyond just marketing.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And, sort of the technologies were changing very rapidly. I think everybody admired what was going on in here in Silicon Valley in terms of sort of the entrepreneurism. Remember there was what do they call it, where they were trying to create entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs inside or whatever.
Right.
And create, so a lot of the big companies were trying to do that. So they were trying to figure out the puzzle and how it worked. So we were able to do work for not only European companies, but big US companies and Japanese companies as well. So we did work for Sony and Mitsubishi.
Another question that I wanted to ask you in this context is, what are some memorable mistakes or missteps that you saw? You mentioned the failure of companies in the conversation you had with Noyce. I'm not thinking so much about company failures. I'm just thinking about other kinds of missteps, in addition to the things like Ken Olsen, for example, saying that the PC was never going to make it. I'm thinking about maybe more either failures to grasp opportunities the companies had right in front of them, or things that they just somehow let slip away that shouldn't have slipped away.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, we've seen that even recently, right? I mean, not that we were consulting to them, but where Intel sort of missed the mobile phone market.
Exactly.
So it continues to happen to companies, and a lot of it's hubris. There was the old BCG chart, which was, the different segments of the market, and this is the established marketplace that you milk. In fact, I think they called it something like, these are the, you just keep milking that business to pay for what's down here. And so what happens is that and I think, what's his name, Christensen from Harvard has written about that. And I think all companies fall into that, even small companies do. They see a big success with their first product, and they feel everything after that. So again, at Apple, you saw the Apple II was wildly successful. It was an open system, it was flexible, and it fit in education, fit into a lot of different marketplaces. But then the Apple III was a failure, and then on to that, there was this concept of the Mac, but along came also Lisa, and Lisa was a failure, even though they put tons of money into it. And so there's these things right beside each other, but I think that from an Apple standpoint, it was lack of industry experience, quite frankly. These were pretty much, a lot of them were, hackers. They were, renegades. They called themselves pirates. They sort of scoffed at people who had been around a while, and so they didn't necessarily me, but they did a lot of particularly the technical people and so forth. So that I know I had conversations with Scully about no one on the board or no one on the executive staff has any depth or experience in computers, and it would be really great to have some people like that who could at least tell you about what comprises, modern day computing systems. Systems, not just a computer, but, let's say a system in a large corporation. Why didn't they get into the business marketplace? Well, because they didn't understand computing systems. And they may not have wanted to do it then because the technology changed that allowed them to then get into it. The internet leveled the playing field, right, for everybody. And once that took place, then, compatibility became less of an issue. And so once you had the internet, then that solved a lot of people's problems. But let's take again, people like Silicon Graphics, who really felt that, they had the world, in their hand, and that hubris is what killed them. They had an opportunity, and I was asked my advice on this. IBM approached Silicon Graphics. They had a workstation to put one of Silicon Graphics graphics engine cards into every PC. Every PC. And this was the world's largest market share of personal computers. And they turned it down because they felt they could do it themselves. And I said, do it. I mean, it will put you on the map. It'll put your graphics engine on the map. And but they were opposed to it.
And was hubris the central reason?
I think so. Yeah. We can do it ourselves. And it turned out their personal computer ended up being a luggable desktop. I mean, the size of one of these.
Yeah.
I think, I don't think they had their eyes or their touch on the real marketplace. I think that that so many companies do that. They really feel as though a little bit of success means a lot of success. And I think what they don't realize is that success is only as good as your next new product. And you have to, and again, I'll use Intel as an example. They didn't let a bad product stop them. They were already on the next one, and on the next one, and on the next one, and the next one. So if you, again, I look through my notebooks, there's just product after product after product. You're just, you're running from one group to another group to another group because everybody was filling you with new ideas and new products and new ways to get something into the marketplace.
It's interesting you contrast Silicon Graphics with Intel because that was a company that made a finished product, the Silicon Graphics workstation, that didn't want to become a component in somebody else's business. Then in Intel, you had a company that essentially was a component product, but they eventually were able to make Intel Inside such an essential part of the finished product that every single PC, no matter whose brand it was, finished that commercial with the Intel ding and the Intel logo, and that had to be there.
That has both a good and a bad side to it.
Yeah.
Because while it enhanced...
Say more about that.
Okay, well, it enhanced certainly Intel's identity in all of these products, but it also it made the PC into a commodity. So that when you went in, I used to say this, when you go into Fry's, you look at all the machines and everyone says Intel Inside. So what do you look for? The price. So if they're all Intel Inside, then they must all be equal. And what's the difference is the price. So unless they painted it different, and almost everybody did the same beige covers and computers, Apple was the only one that was different. So Apple was the one product that got a premium price for their products because they didn't have Intel Inside and because they didn't look like everybody else. They did something different. And so I always felt that Intel, while it was everybody, sort of the old slogan, the ad won all the awards, but the company went bankrupt. People loved the advertising and the promotion, and I'm sure they still praise and talk about it. But enhanced, they hastened the commoditization of the personal computer, and that drove prices down. And IBM got out of the business as a result. So one of their biggest customer quite frankly, vanished.
So, in other words, it succeeded in making Intel a household word, even though it was only a component.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it also depressed and eventually unwound a big part of the market. That's an interesting.
Yeah, but Intel also, I mean,
Result.
it's a component, but it's really a system. They started, and this is one of the things that they learned in marketing the microprocessor, where in the early days it was looked at as a component, and people said it will sell a lot of memory. That was what the reason they were promoting it, because you had to have a lot of storage hanging off of this machine or this part. But as we went from 71 to 75, 76, and on in, up into the 8-bit, particularly the 8080 and the 8086, then it became looking more like a system on a chip. And then as they got into the 32-bit and so forth, that went even one step higher. And so these became systems products. So you were essentially sort of putting a module inside a case that gave it all its smarts and brains. So Intel was marketing a full functioning processor within that. And with all the, in fact, you buy the card and you didn't have to build the cards themselves because Intel made the single board computer. And, and so to market it as a chip was not the way it ended up. They marketed it as, your completely packaged computer within a computer, and you didn't have to do much but add the applications, and some unique character functionality, but it was pretty much given to you, and you could get to market fast. So it's why IBM was sort of bypassed the original IBM channels. Remember, they went to Boca Raton. Don Estridge became the president, and Don went, to Intel and Motorola, and had them compete for the processor. They went out and basically captured Microsoft to be the software supplier, and so in effect, both Intel and Microsoft became, got 90% of the PC marketplace because of IBM's selection. And that was a big marketplace. And they were to market much faster than they would have been. It would have taken them 5 to 7 or 8 years to get to market. And instead it took them, I think, two or three. So they were in the marketplace very, very quickly. And I think that was also sort of a model for other people that were in the hardware business, that what counts is really the software and the architecture and the systems and the nature of the suppliers and that you get to supply those critical parts. And thus Apple eventually got into that business themselves by doing away with all of the manufacturing and piece picking and put it all into a logistics system.
Was it contentious within Intel to embark on this Intel Inside strategy? And when I ask that question, I mean, you were still at the center of an enormous amount of their marketing effort as that was happening.
Not when Intel Inside.
Not when Intel Inside was happening?
No, that came after.
Okay.
That came in the late 90s. Yeah. I know the people who did it, but I think that came later. But it was, I don't think it was contentious. I think the real contentious aspect of when Intel was in that business was whenever they had the memory, the RAM memory business and the EEPROM business, and then they had the processor business. And the processor business they were investing in, but there wasn't a return. Right. Where the memory was kind of a hot business, but prices were being driven down by Japanese competitors. And so they weren't making money on the memory, and they weren't yet making money on the processor. And so the memory people and the microprocessor people were a bit at odds.
I'm going to ask you in this last segment about your company's publishing strategy. It was really your publishing strategy. In the oral history, we're going to include PDFs of the brochures, the marketing brochures that you wrote, and samples of newsletters and other things that you initiated as part of the building of the company. Can you talk about what the genesis of that strategy was, and what the impact of all that publishing that you did over time turned out to be?
Well, as I told you, almost everything began with a slide presentation. You know, I would do talks and either to my own people or to customers or to people who, you know, hired me to do it, and that would sort of crystallize my thinking around a subject, and then I would write it up, usually on an airplane somewhere. I spent a lot of time on airplanes, and that was where I got more writing done than anything, and back and forth between countries and East and West Coast, and so I would write them out in a notebook, and then the whole idea was to sort of educate our customer base, our client base, but just like the evening with programs, I sent it to everybody, you know, all the people on my mailing list. I had a list called an FYI list, and these little FYI stickers, you know, and I would personally, you know, sign them, and we would put those on the pamphlets or newsletters. Or we also had I hired a writer from Electronic News to do a newsletter for us that we did regularly, and got beat up over that by the journalists who said, you know, we shouldn't be in the journalism business. But it was an objective newsletter. It was I gave the guy carte blanche to do it as a journalist, not as somebody who worked for us. And I had thoughts of doing, because at that time when the personal computer was coming into the business, we were publishing a magazine called Apple, and we published 4 editions of Apple magazine, and it was really a slick magazine. In fact, the original copies of it are at the Smithsonian, and one was on business, one was on education, different subject matter like that, and I wanted to sustain that, so I hired some editors, I hired writers, and Apple decided to do it themselves, so they took it over, and they never did. They never did issue number 5. We did a newsletter for Genentech, and they never did issue number 5. We did a newsletter for a lot of the, you know, we'd do these things for companies, and then they would say, "Oh, it's too expensive. We'll cut the cost. We'll do it ourselves," and they never would. So whereas you know, I had all these writers and so forth that we could use. So I thought very seriously about creating a publishing business. That's where I started in the publishing business, and you know, becoming a PC magazine or whatever at that time. But you know, with all the clients we had, and with trying to pay attention to that, in the meantime having clients say we'll do it ourselves, it took the revenue away from the early products, and so you know, I couldn't afford to keep that staff anymore, so it kind of dwindled away.
But you did keep short form client communications alive for a very long time.
The pamphlets, the pamphleteering, and other things that we put out.
Yeah.
Those were largely little lessons, and it came from the whole idea of you know, our founding fathers who did pamphleteering to start the revolution.
Really?
Well, we're in the middle of Silicon Valley, the revolution, and I thought, you know, we need a revolution in marketing. They got to start understanding it isn't sales, you know, it isn't engineering. It's not the same. And so I started writing these things on different aspects of marketing, and publishing them. And I think probably the sort of symbol of it being successful was that after Steve Jobs went back to Apple in 97 or 98, he called me one weekend and asked me, you know, he said he was going through his desk drawer and he came across them, several of them that he kept, and he wanted to know if he could reproduce them for his internal marketing people. So I know he did that, so you know, that sort of proved that they at least got some exposure beyond the original distribution. I think they were very successful. They were hard to do because, you know, just finding time to do them. and do them on a unique subject. But and I would give speeches. I gave a talk at the some international symposium in Hong Kong, and published that talk and other things that we did. Try to keep them from being promotional. And the other thing was we did articles and even backgrounders on companies. And the idea was the most credible backgrounders on a company were done by analysts because they didn't use all the adjectives. And I used to say the good backgrounder has no adjectives. It's no superlatives. We're not the first, the finest, the best, the most fastest, all those sort of things. Forget about all that talk, and just tell people what it is, and as plain English as you can, and that's what we do with our backgrounders. And they also were used. We would have people work on those for weeks and months at a time on a company, on products, on product lines, on the company itself.
And how did you use those?
The company used them. Those become part of the company, and we would send it to the media and to the analysts. And in fact, on the backgrounder on the 8080, I even got rejected 8080 chips and put one on had one pasted on every one of them in the front so that they could actually see what the processor looked like.
What the processor looked like.
Yeah. So it was it was just part of getting the message out and getting the education out there. It was just something innate in me, I guess.
Same with the books?
Yeah, well, the book started with, it started with presentations, and a woman named Ann Dilworth, who was a publisher at, she was a publisher, a publishing company in Boston, Reed Elsevier, or one of those. They published most of the computer books. And Ann approached me and asked me if I would write a book. And that was the Regis Touch. And so I did that one. And of course you got to do follow-ons. And so I did a total of 5 books, but the last 3 were done by Harvard Business. They were acquired, and then Harvard Business Review. I got to know Ted Levitt, who was the editor of Harvard Business Review, and he invited me to write some articles for Harvard Business Review. I up until probably I don't remember, maybe the early 90s, most of the articles in Harvard Business Review came from the big East Coast consulting firms or from professors, and Ted Levitt changed that. He even shocked everybody by putting cartoons in Harvard Business Review and by doing interviews. I think he interviewed Bob Noyce for one, and things like that. I mean, he tried to make it a much more interesting journal and readable. And so he asked me to do some articles, and there was who was the guy, Alan Weber, who was the assistant publisher or editor, and Alan became my editor at Harvard Business Review. He left and later on and came on to found Fast Company magazine, and now is the mayor of Santa Fe.
Was your process with them the same as it is with every publisher? You have an idea, there's some dialogue about it, or were they really very quick to say, yeah, this is a book we think we want to do?
No. We had a lot of discussions over it. You do an outline, you do a proposal. I was fortunate that Ann Dilworth wrote most of my proposals for me, even after I was no longer. I would talk to her about it, and she would write it because she was a publisher. So she helped me with most of my presentations or proposals, but the books themselves largely came out of working with clients and in the industry. The Regis Touch was just sort of a synopsis of what I had been doing up till that date. It was much more based on OEM kind of marketing,
Yeah.
face-to-face, being able to change and re-engineer products.
And the way you thought about the world.
And the way we thought about and Who's Afraid of Big Blue came out of watching all the small companies. I'm working with a lot of them. Total Access, or Real Time came from basically real time. It was watching the speeds of things increase and knowing that, first it was radio and then you increase the bandwidth, you got television. And as you go up the bandwidth channel, you start finding more and more stuff you can put across that wire or that airwave channel. And it had to change, it had to become more robust. It just was sort of logical to do that. It wasn't anything magic. And to where that was going to change our lives, because you could look again at the consumer industry. Fashions were changing very quickly. I knew a fellow who was the head of Japan's Nike division, and I got to visit him and see him a couple times and talk with him and got to know him. And he was saying that they were changing their styles, every 3 months in Japan, because people were buying them. And so you started seeing, well, this means that manufacturing is becoming more flexible, the design's becoming more flexible. You look into that, you start finding fashions are now done by freelancers. They're telecommunicated to somewhere in Japan or Korea or Taiwan, and basically within 2 weeks they're up on Macy's shelf, on the racks at Macy's. And so if you look into the background of it, you start seeing all of these real-time sort of things occurring, which is, the distance between want and satisfaction goes to zero. And so you think about Amazon now, where you order something and you get it the next day. And if they can probably have their way, you get it that day. But it's this want, and it's more of a want than a need, but it's instantly satisfied. And that means that so many things, because when you train the consumer, they look at that in all aspects of their lives, maybe unconsciously. But I think they want solutions now, and why they're so willing to, perhaps in political circumstances, willing to get somebody who says, I can solve your problem now. Yeah. And it can become very dangerous. And I've written about that, about the fact that it will see faster turns in political cycles and so forth, just because of that.
And then what about Total Access?
Total Access was the whole idea that access is replacing broadcast. That if you think about the broadcast channels, there was the major networks were the prime, I don't know, what was there, 6 or 7, prime channels. And I would ask people, how many channels are there on the internet? Well, as many as there are individuals. Everybody could be broadcasting, and that's tens of thousands, if not millions, of channels on the internet. And so that means that people will no longer wait for something, they'll access it. So access replaced broadcast, and what that means is you have a lot more people to listen to, which means you've got to have automated listening systems. It's the automatic going from push button or rotary dial to push button. The signals now are there instantaneously by code, so you put that into software and systems that essentially do all of the work for you behind the scenes. And so when you do a search for a product, the response is less than 5 seconds, and they're looking at a myriad of databases. It's not just one database. It might be comparing them across a whole spectrum. They may find models, they may find all kinds of things, but it's instantaneous, looking at data from a variety of sources, pulling it together and giving it to you without you having to wait. Because if you wait more than 20 seconds, you're off. You hang up.
You're Or you think you've got a Wi-Fi problem or something has gone wrong.
Yeah. I mean, there are people used to find that little shopping basket was left full most of the time, because by the time they were able to find the other products, they were ready to go, that they wanted to put in that basket, and I think it's probably still that way, but less so because the delivery cycles, the logistics systems become so sophisticated. And of course, if I were to do something else, I'd have to talk about the whole downsides of that, but that's the downsides of that, or what I said, is that people become manipulated simply by the speed of data. And so some of the large software companies now are using that data. That becomes the product, so you're essentially supplying them the product that they sell. And it's more valuable than the information that you're putting in it. Or no, it's not more valuable than the information you're putting in, it's more valuable than the system itself, because that's how they pay for it. And but that's the downside of it, is this whole accessibility into everything you think, know, or want to know, or want to buy. And so I've had one person who was head of one of the logistics systems at a major personal computer company tell me, I can tell you what you're going to want to buy next month,
And mean it.
And mean it, yeah.
Yeah. And so your partnership with Harvard on these books was, it got them 3 really terrific books, and it provided
But fighting,
you with the outlet.
a lot of fighting,
Yeah.
because this is where we get down to East Coast versus West Coast again.
Interesting.
Because what they do is they take the draft of the book and they pass it around to Harvard Business School professors and say, would you critique it before we publish it? And all I remember is one line from one of them wrote, Regis McKenna is drinking the West Coast Kool-Aid. That was on Real Time. And, so they were still taking they were still selling their textbooks for 20, 30 years ago and making a lot of money on them. Their textbooks were running $150, $200 or maybe more. And so they wanted to keep, around the marketing as the 3 Ps or whatever it is, And I said in that book that there's the famous 3 Ps by some guy he was out of University of Chicago. The customer doesn't begin with P,
Were you, what sort of response did you get from people in marketing at the business school, at Harvard Business School, to these books?
Well, I think that, the Marketing is Everything became one of the, I think, best-selling reprints.
One of the
they
most
had.
reprinted articles in the history of the magazine.
Yeah. So I think that message is, and I'm still asked to talk on that, and I'm still invited to talk on it, even now.
Would you say that if there's one thing that distilled your thinking about marketing in one place, that article is it?
Harvard Business Review?
That marketing is everything.
Oh,
that
yeah.
article.
Yeah. I think I think I would write it differently today because there's more evidence.
Is there an article out there called "Marketing is Still Everything"?
Yeah, probably it would, because logistics have become so much more sophisticated, and it's more machine to machine than it is human to machine or machine to human, and so the ability to record see where you've been, see where you're going, see what you're selecting, and then feed that into the system and have it sort of anticipate your needs and wants, makes it almost Orwellian. And so I think that that would have to be thought through very carefully, I think, to to do a book on that, to say what is happening, and is it good or bad for us. And I don't think it's totally bad for us, but I think there are ways in which we're still learning to adapt to it, and there are people who are hurt by it. We've seen that in parts of the world where, Facebook, for example, was used as a weapon in political battles and so forth, and so lots of other social media, and it certainly wasn't intended to that, even by, I think, the founders. But tools in the hands of the wrong people become the wrong tools, and I think this is going to get more serious consideration in the next decade. It has to. One of the things that I was the founder of the Center for Science, Technology, and Society, or one of the founders at Santa Clara University. Now they've changed that, but there is a chair there called the Chair for Science, Technology, and Society that I've funded, and the whole purpose of that, which was some more than 10 years ago, I started, was to look at the social and implications of technology, and how it's changing humanity, how it's changing our societies, and how particularly students in school can begin to learn more about how it's impacting people's lives, and to do some serious work in terms of going into companies and how you design software, how you design products, how you become more ethical in what you're doing. And I think that some of the people that are in social media today are truly out of the sort of the technical schools without any sort of, liberal arts kind of background in terms of looking at the world and the history, the societies, the impact of culture, all of those kinds of things. I define culture as the things that we learn in our society in order to survive. I don't mean just physically survive, but culturally survive, socially survive. So people adapt these things in order to think they're part of the current culture, and they're absorbed into it, and they're captured by it without ever thinking about it, because you don't have to think about this stuff anymore. You turn it on and it's there. And you had to work even at a newspaper, and it reminds me of one of my granddaughters. This was a few years ago, but everything to her was, going online and searching her iPhone or whatever. And she said, we were talking, we'd always have conversations at dinner about politics or about the latest things we've read in the newspaper, or New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, the Atlantic or something. We talk about articles and things. And so the next day, she came down from breakfast, and she was staying with us, and she was looking at the morning newspaper, the New York Times, and she was reading an article really intently, and I looked at her and I said, "What are you reading?" She says, "It's amazing what you can read in a newspaper." I mean, they don't, Tony Ritter, who was the publisher of the San Jose Mercury, told me 25 years ago that the only people who are reading newspapers today are white males over 50. It was just declining so rapidly. And that's continuing, and they're looking for alternative ways to make money now to sustain the salaries of journalists and publishers. And so you've got to get good journalism into this media, and good perspective and objective writing. And for now, you have to search for that. It's not automatically there. What's automatically there is the easy stuff, the stuff that you don't have to work to get, and it's being manipulated.
That brings me to one final question or area that I wanted to talk about in this session, which is you learned marketing in a certain context, media and business and society. People are graduating from marketing programs today, let's say in 2019, with a social and business and communications context that is very different from that one. And I just wonder, when you look at those things, and having written and researched as extensively as you have over your career, how do you feel marketing professionals today regard the world, regard us as consumers? It's a very important point. Versus the way marketing professionals regarded those endpoints in the past, and does that begin to feed on itself, and the differences that they experience now cause them to think and act in a different way, and suddenly the whole thing is kind of spinning forward, as you say, it's integrating forward?
Yeah, I think that one of the big demarcations for me in my career was the whole idea that marketing has become more of marcom, marketing communications, and less strategy, less product development, less feedback systems, and channels, and those sorts of things, and partnering. It's become more of a promotional, and that business is still thriving and doing well. And
the marcoms business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, this is, I don't know, 20 years ago or more, I started buying old books on marketing that go back to the 1930s and 20s, when marketing was actually coined as a term in about the 1920s and between the 1920 and 1930 in the Midwest, and it was around farming goods. It was farming schools, the universities. And if you studied marketing, you didn't call it marketing. You studied economics, you studied distribution, channels, what we would call logistics today. You studied all of those sorts of things, and even the economics became really important, because when you think about some of the early marketers, in fact, I think it was a retail clothing store in Pittsburgh called Kaufman's. It was a department store, and they came up with, I think, one of the first credit cards. So when people were saving their money to buy things, it may take you 2 years to buy a bedroom furniture set, where you could go and use your Kaufman's credit card and buy a bedroom set and pay for it, $5 a month for, so many years. And that really brought retail marketing up to a new level. So it was the financing of ordinary people to buy goods. So it was really the economics to drive that says, well, they don't have access to capital. How do we give them access to capital? And we all win. So they got a little bit of interest off of that, but they also got increased orders and faster turnaround on their inventories. So the economics was behind that. And I think as I went back and read these early marketing books, I think they had the right sense of marketing. It really is about economics, and it is about the enhancing of the marketplace so that there's a return for everybody. And whether it's a learning experience or whether it's benefits, but I think now it is purely more, as I say, information has become consumable. It is a consumable, and it's no longer a valued experience that you want to retain and hold on to as something precious. It is, to be forgotten very quickly. So you experience something and that's it. That's that day. because there's so much coming at you every day. You just can't keep up with it. And most people, even, the most brilliant of us, have a hard time keeping up with the deluge of new facts and data coming at us every day, and new comments. That's not the way it used to be. And I'm not saying we can't go back to that, but we've got to find a way to put more human values into our communications today. And I'm not sure, I don't know the answer to that. But I think that people are going to increasingly demand it, because you can see the furor that's being raised by the social media today by all sorts of people. I think Facebook has lost 5 million, something more like that, customers in the last 2 years or something. Certainly millions of customers have dropped off. I know my wife has completely dropped off, and several members of my family. I hear more and more people that are doing that. And there's books coming out on it, and other types of things that I think are going to make them sit up. Congress is not going to take any action until it has to. I just saw an article on, what was it called? It was, I sent it around to a lot of people. Why is our Congress so dumb? And they use the interviews of the social media presidents and staffs, where the congressmen simply didn't know that Facebook sold advertising. They didn't know the difference between an iPhone and in Google's
Google search engine.
Search, those kind of things. So in a way, that's the fault of the people who are not educating them one way or another. And if the schools don't do it, and I suspect there's more and more schools that are taking this sort of subject on, because it's interesting, and bless you, it's interesting, and it's going to have and students want to learn about it. I know that. Right now, I have, I think there are 3 or 4 young college students who have contacted me to simply meet and sit and talk about marketing, because that's what they want to go into, or that's what they're in, at various universities around the United States. So I sit, so I go have Starbucks with them, and we sit and talk, and then they've stayed in touch with me. And so I've sent them some of my old pamphlets. And they tell me what they're learning, and I sort of try to tell them what I think marketing should or shouldn't be. And they're just sort of private friends, and they absorb it very fast.
Are you surprised at what they're learning?
I've had, not these particular people, but I've had others say to me that when I've given a talk at a couple business schools, is if this is what marketing is all, we're not learning it. Because there's still, this is a true story, and I'm not going to mention the professor because people would recognize the name, but it was a well-known professor who's published marketing books, and is still selling the same books that he wrote about years and years ago. And I was in Brazil, and I was giving a talk on, it was called real-time, I think it was called something like real-time logistics and marketing. And it was on there I started saying, I made a list. There was one chart in which I listed all of the traditional functions of marketing. Distribution, pricing, customer surveys, product selection, all of these kind of, there's about 10 things. And then over here I put what we do today. That none of those really apply. Distribution is logistics. Pricing is done by comparative pricing across the network, about looking at where prices in spot markets and so forth, and then combining it and doing algorithms around looking at the optimum price for products. So again, it's put into an algorithm. So any aspect of marketing today is being done. Even the advertising is combined at the last second for you specifically. If you're looking for something, it can be go out and find out what you're just asking against databases that have a lot of different data, pull it together, synthesize it, put it in an algorithm, and say, here's your specific answer that you're looking for. And it's completely out of sort of human hands. And so I put up this list in Hollar Marketing, and we went into the speaker's room afterwards, and he came over to me, and I had met him before, but hadn't had a lot of conversation with him, and he said to me, is that real? I said, what? He said, that chart you put up of things changing. I said, yeah, it's absolutely real. It's what's happening today. And he said, could I have that chart? And he had never been to Silicon Valley. He had never really visited any of these companies. And so, this is the hubris of it's going to be the way it always was.
Yeah.
And it isn't. It isn't. It's you've got to get used to change and figure out how to get a step ahead of it if you can.
So bringing it back to your earlier comment, when a student says to you, if this is what marketing is, this is not what we're learning, it means they're actually behind the curve in some of what they're learning, not thinking about.
I don't think that's true in engineering.
Today.
I don't think that's true in software. I don't think that's true in a lot of the sciences.
Well, it can't be.
It can't be.
Because those schools won't turn out graduates that are.
Yeah, and they're coming in usually with knowledge that the engineers you have are not aware of.
Yeah.
Whereas I think in some of the more classical kinds of things, like marketing, I don't think it's. I mean, there are some schools that are doing a lot of. They bring students out here and have them work alongside or go into sabbaticals, or not sabbaticals, but sort of as interns in companies and so forth. So that sort of thing, you get on the ground, you get real life experience, and that's probably the best way to do it. I know in my company, we always hired summer people out of school and so forth and had them work with us. That, I think that put them right in there with all the other people and let them meet the same clients and so forth and see how things are done and see how fluid it is and how changing it is and how demanding it is. But the whole idea of, I think, broadening your horizons and your knowledge base is something that I don't think is really taught today. And I just was taught that from a very young age to be curious about a lot of different things because they ultimately all have impact on each other.
Well, and that takes us all the way back really to the first session that we did to start this series, and your experience and your education and the people you met and who made an impression on you as part of your educational experience. So.
Yeah.